At the same time, the ethical substance is divided with respect to its form or to knowing. Spirit, when acting, appears qua consciousness over against the object to which its activity is directed and which consequently is determined as the negative of the knower. The doer finds himself thereby in the antithesis of knowing and not knowing. He takes his purpose from his character and knows it as an ethical essentiality, but on account of the determinateness of his character, he knows only the one power of substance, the other remaining for him concealed. The present reality is therefore one thing in itself and another thing for consciousness. The upper and the nether law come to signify in this connection the power that knows and reveals itself to consciousness and the power that conceals itself and lies in ambush. The one is the aspect of light, the god of the oracle, who in accordance with its natural moment has sprung from the all-illuminating sun, knows all and reveals all. Phoebus, and Zeus, who is his father. But the commands of this truth-speaking God and his announcements of what is are really deceptive. For this knowing is in its principle immediately a not knowing, because consciousness in its action is in its own self this antithesis. He who is able to unlock the riddle of the Sphinx and he who trusted with childlike confidence are, therefore, both sent to destruction through what the God revealed to them. This priestess, through whom the beautiful God speaks, is in no way different from the equivocating sisters of fate who by their promises drive to crime those who listen to them and who by the double-tongued character of what they announce as a certainty deceive him who relied on the obvious meaning. The consciousness, therefore, that is purer than the latter, which believes witches, and is more prudent, more solid, and more thorough than the former, which trusts the priestess and the beautiful God, tarries with his revenge, even though the very spirit of his father reveals to him the crime by which he was murdered, and institutes still other proofs, for the reason that this revelatory spirit could also be the devil. In paragraph 737, Hegel is now turning away from just looking at content, Inhalt, that has been divided no longer into a multiplicity, but into two sides from each other. And now he's looking at a division, or rather an apportioning is a better way of translating it, Nachteilen in the German, into different parts of, as he says, the form, or in this specific instance, the form of what? The form of acting and knowing, Wissen. So knowledge or knowing and acting are not so radically dissociated from each other in Hegel as they often are in other thinkers, where we have the theoretical side and then we have the practical side. We saw this very much so in the discussion in the spirit section, leading into the morality section, which was quite long. And we saw this happening particularly in terms of the various dynamics leading ultimately up to the French Revolution, described in terms of absolute freedom and the terror, right? Here it's a different context, but you can say that knowing and acting are closely associated. We often learn or come to know, or acting itself, and acting not just in terms of doing one action, but in terms of sequences of actions, intentional action. Handeln is the term being used here, as opposed to, mere tat, a deed. We often learn things in the action itself. And in tragedy, you often learn, oh man, did I get things wrong? And we're going to hit on those examples in just a moment. Hegel is actually moving out of just references to Greek tragedy and into Shakespearean tragedy as well. And we could also think of other things that are on the scene. We could come up with all sorts of other great examples to flesh this out with. So the form, or the knowing, is where there's a division. Previous paragraph, it talked about a division of the content. And there we were looking primarily at the totality of the tragedy, right, with two different main poles, two different powers. Here we're looking at a character, a hero, a protagonist, and what it is that they think that they know and what they actually don't know, and the actions that they engage in on that basis. And I will point out that Hegel, towards the end of the paragraph, in referencing Hamlet, at least as far as Miller's concerned, and I think this is completely correct, given the other clues that Hegel is providing us with here, we do have an exception to the rule, a character who's not jumping beyond their knowledge, thinking that they actually have knowledge of things. So let's take a look at the text. This is a very rich passage. At the same time, the, in brackets, ethical, this is Miller, substance, is divided with respect to its former knowing. So let's stop right there. Why did Miller translate this as the ethical substance, given that the German term is actually Wesen, the essence or being? There's some decent reason for this. I think this is one of those cases where Miller is being a little bit too prescriptive and not letting the reader just read. What are we talking about as this Wesen, this being that gets divided? Well, there's a couple different possibilities which are not completely divided from each other. There's spirit, of course, and we're going to see spirit coming up in the very next few sentences. There is the ethical substance that has been brought up, the ethical substance referring all the way back to what we're playing around with and trying to understand in the reason and even more in the spirit section, particularly the early part of the spirit section that Hegel has just referenced in the previous paragraph and which he is going to reference again in this paragraph, where we have the two laws and the tragedy in question is really the Antigone, one that Hegel thought was very important. What else could we talk about? Substance, of course, right? Substanz, but also subject. Just in the previous paragraph, he told us, right? This is towards the end. The previous dispersion of the whole into manifold and abstract forces is the dissolution of the subject, which comprehends them only as moments within itself. Right, so this is quite important, and he ended by talking about characters, and that is what we're getting to in this point. Character in a double sense: the character who is the knowing, acting person, for example, Hamlet or Oedipus or Macbeth, or pick whoever else you want, and their own character, the set of temperaments and ethical dispositions that they have that defines who they are. So now that we've clarified that, let's go on a little bit. He says, here we go, spirit, when acting not in the sense of just engaging in one big deed, but in a whole sequence of coherent, consistent action, Handeln, spirit in acting, appears qua consciousness, so consciousness, over against the object to which its activity is directed, and which consequently is determined as the negative of the knower. Now, at this point, object, Gegenstand, it could be a physical object. Think about somebody breaking rocks, so that they can take them and make them into a rock fence, or because they've been condemned to a chain gang and stupid, meaningless activity of breaking rocks, or because there's a giant rock that's standing in the way of plowing a field and they need to break it up and they don't have dynamite to do that. We could go on and on. There's intentionalities involved there, and there's an acting subject, and then there's an object that is not merely the object of the action, but something that stands against it, Gegenstand, right? It is there. An artist who is carving a statue takes the wood block or the marble or whatever it's going to be as the object. They also have an object in a different sense, the Zweck or purpose, what it is that they want to turn this into. In the case of a big rock that you want to turn into little rocks. Little rocks is the end purpose of it, right? And maybe you put them into a wheelbarrow and carry them away, or you turn them into a fence. In the case of the wood block that the carver is going to turn into a statue of Pan playing his pipes and dancing around that, well, the end point is that statue. And then there can be other ends, like, well, this is going to be decorative. I'm going to use this in worship or something like that. So the object stands against the doer and the knower. And the knower knows the object to some degree. It's not a complete black hole, a total non-entity, because otherwise you can't direct action towards it, can you, right? So if we go on, he says, the doer, so the object is determined as the negative of the knower. And what does the doer find themselves in? The antithesis of knowing and not knowing. Here we need to bring up once again, an issue of translation, a important not only lexical but conceptual point. So antithesis here is Gegensatz, what we would typically translate as contradiction, right? Although, Widerspruch can also be used for that, and Gegengesetzte. So there's a lot of different oppositions. We have an antithesis, which is not leading to a synthesis. It's just two things being opposed to each other. Which of them is the thesis? Neither of them are the thesis. They're both antitheses to each other. Knowing, Wissen, right? And then not knowing, Nichtwissen. Nichtwissen is an interesting thing to say because it's kind of an equivocal term, right? Knowing not, right? Knowing that something is not something else or is not what you originally thought it was is one way we could think of this. We could also think of it as simply not knowing. There are some things that you do know, and there are other things that you don't know, and you don't even know that you don't know them, right? They are unknown unknowns. It can also be knowing the not, knowing the negativity of the object. And that's going to happen later on when you come to the point where you're like, holy crap, did I make a mistake? Wow. This is a big part of much tragedy. There's this reversal that takes place, and it's not just a reversal of fortune, it's also a revelation of what there is to be known. So, for example, Oedipus, let's take that as the prime case. What does Oedipus learn? Well, let's think back about the story that he's in, right? There's a prophecy that little Oedipus is going to kill his father and marry his mother. The people of Thebes are like, this is terrible. Let's get rid of this kid, right? And so he's abandoned. He's raised by, if I remember right, the Corinthians. And he leaves, so he won't fulfill that prophecy. And he winds up on the way to Thebes. And he meets the Sphinx, and we'll talk about that later on. And he runs into a guy, and this guy's kind of a jerk. And the guy says, get the hell out of my way. I'm in my chariot. And Oedipus says, screw you, old man. You want to fight? And so they do. And Oedipus lays him out. And then he's like, well, I kill a lot of people. It's kind of a lawless time in Greece. Let's keep going on to Thebes, right? And he gets there, and then he finds out, oh, the city is in uproar. Somebody killed the king. And, the queen, who is beautiful, has been, left on her own. What are we going to do? And Oedipus steps in, and he's like, yeah, I can be your king, and I'll marry this beautiful woman here, and I'll produce a lineage so that everything is secure. 2 daughters, 2 sons. This is amazing. And then a plague comes to the land, and it's because nobody has taken care of and punished the killer of the earlier king, Laius, who turns out is Oedipus's father, right? The husband of Jocasta before Oedipus became her husband. And Oedipus is like, yeah, definitely, we got to punish this guy. Let's find out what's what. And they even bring in Tiresias, this famous sage and oracle, a wise man who's got all sorts of cool stories of his own about having been a man and a woman and how he ended up being blind and stuff like that. And Oedipus says to him, hey, you got to tell us the answer to this because we haven't been able to find it through our own detective work. And he says, I don't think you want the answer. So what do we have here? We have this antithesis of knowing and not knowing. And at this point, Oedipus doesn't know in the sense of like there's information about this object, the thing he wants to do, set things right, that's missing. And Tiresias has that information and eventually reveals it to him. This, by the way, is not a totally unique trope. Where else does it show up? In the stories of David in the Bible, right? After he had Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite, put into the front line so he could get him killed and then take Bathsheba into his harem, and then another plague comes, and then Nathan the prophet says, you're the guy, you're the one who's causing this stuff, right? So Oedipus finds out, and what he learns is not good information, right? And it's not good information not just for him, but also for everybody around him. We have Jocasta, his wife, and his mother hanging herself. We have Oedipus gouging his own eyes out and abandoning the kingship to his sons who are also his brothers. We have his two daughters who are going to get into problems of their own. Oedipus actually leaves, and he can't get away because they still want to use him in terms of power struggles and things that are going on. It is a massive mess produced through action and knowledge, right? And so sometimes, maybe Nichtwissen is better. But there's also the coming to know the nothingness of these things. So let's go on as well. Coming back to this, right? The antithesis of knowing and not knowing. He takes his purpose, who's the hero, the character, from his character, now we're talking about ethical character, and knows it as, now here's an interesting term, an ethical essentiality, right? So they know his character as an ethical essentiality. Sittliche, okay, that's ethical. Wesenheit, not Wesen, but Wesenheit, something that is essential to a person. And because this person is not just a single person on their own, but rather is, somebody who's at the top of their hierarchy, food chain, whatever you want to call it, it's going to be an essentiality for their culture as well. And he says, he takes this purpose from his character. So the purpose is reaching out to the object. He says, on account of the determinateness of his character, he only knows the one power of substance, the other remaining for him concealed. So where are these powers coming from? This is the division within the content that we saw in the last paragraph. He's on one side, or she, Antigone, right? Maybe even, can we fold the Medea in here? I don't know. I don't know that fits the mold quite as well. Perhaps it does, perhaps it doesn't. That's a good one to think about. So one side of the substance. The other side of the substance is over here. The negative, the object, the thing that is in itself, and now being talked about as a concealed power. The other power is remaining for him concealed. Is it remaining concealed for the rest of the actors in the play? Yes, also them, except for, in this case, with Oedipus, Tiresias, right? So he goes on and he says, the present reality is therefore one thing in itself and another thing for consciousness. We have the in itself, or an sich, right? And we have consciousness over here. Reality itself is not all of the reality that we could know. So acting, or Handel in the Spirit, is spread over all of this, but the character only knows a portion of it, the portion that they know well because it's within the realm of their consciousness. So he goes on and he says, the upper and nether law, reference back to the earlier spirit section, right, and to the previous paragraph. The upper and nether law come to signify in this connection the power that knows and reveals itself to consciousness, and the power that conceals itself and lies in ambush. And at this point we're splitting them into two things. We have the upper law, the lower law. We've got a problem there, an antithesis, a Gegensatz, because law should encompass all of this, right? And each of these laws is struggling against the other law. In a certain sense, they're lawless, right? We also have this entire dynamic going on with this concealed power, this concealed substance, this concealed essentiality as well, that seems to have its own purposes. So we have the power that knows and reveals itself to consciousness. This can be the God. This can be the oracle. This can also be the character displaying itself, right? The hero is kind of godlike in this respect. And then we have, as he says, the power that doesn't just conceal itself, but that lies in ambush. Ooh, that's an interesting way to think about it. So up until this point, we've been looking at this as an object. There's a certain passivity on this side. Even to talk about the upper law and the nether law is kind of, it's below, it doesn't act all that much. If it does so in subterranean ways. Lying in ambush means there's agency there. There's intentionality that is alien to the knowing and acting consciousness. And it is also conscious on its own side, but it's not brought into consciousness at this point, right? So what can this be? He says, the one is the aspect of light, the God of the oracle, who in accordance with its natural moment has sprung from the all-illuminating sun, knows all, reveals all. Phoebus and Zeus, who is his father, right? Phoebus, Apollo, god of prophecy. You go to Delphi, and, it's really great because Zeus is, above the board, right? And Apollo is like totally transparent in this respect. And you go and ask the oracle stuff. Now, the oracle is kind of funny, right? Because the oracle is also part of these chthonic forces. She's sniffing in the fumes coming in from wherever, and things are being revealed in a cave, and then the answers are kind of obscure. You can take them if you want to as being like totally clear, but you do so at your peril, right? Like Hegel says, the commands of this truth-speaking God and his announcements of what reality is, are really deceptive. Why? Well, we got this antithesis again. This knowing is, in its principle, immediately a not knowing. Why? Because consciousness, in its action, is in its own self this antithesis. So the antithesis is not just between knowing and not knowing on the part of the character. It is an antithesis that is running throughout reality itself and part of the very structure of action. Ooh, this is going to be a problem, isn't it? So here we see a reference to the Sphinx. He who is able to unlock the riddle of the Sphinx. The Sphinx asks, this puzzle. And I won't rehearse it because I don't want to take up too much time, but Oedipus answers it, right? And then the Sphinx is like, okay, you can go on. And he who trusted with childlike confidence are therefore sent to destruction through what the God revealed to them. And now here's an interesting thing. So Miller, in his translation, here he provides a bunch of footnotes. Very unusual for Miller to unpack it this way. He wants to say that he who trusted with childlike confidence is Orestes. If you don't know the story of Orestes, right? Orestes is the son of Agamemnon, and Agamemnon is the war leader who takes the Greek host to Troy and has to sacrifice his daughter in order to allow the ships to pass. Does so. Clytemnestra, his wife, gets really ticked off about that, starts plotting revenge, hooks up with a cousin, Aegisthus, who is, connected to Agamemnon. And there's bad blood going back several generations when it comes to that. And so they plot that when he returns, they're going to kill this guy. And to cap it all off, Agamemnon comes back, and he's got a war captive that he's taken essentially as a concubine, right? And she is the prophetess, Cassandra, who nobody listens to, who says, don't go in there, they're going to kill you, right? So he goes in and they say, let's draw you a nice bath, and in the bathtub, Clytemnestra and Aegisthus kill him. And now Orestes has a little dilemma. What do I do? Man, I'm supposed to avenge my dad, but on the other side, I'm not supposed to kill my mom, so what do I do? And he does actually end up doing in Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus, and then he is pursued by the Furies. Is this really referring to that story, or is this still about Oedipus? I don't really know. I mean, Oedipus has a kind of childlike confidence as well. So he says, therefore, both sent to destruction through what the god revealed to them. I mean, there's a lot of revelations. So, and he goes on, he says, this priestess through whom the beautiful God speaks is in no way different, now here he brings in Shakespearean plays, from the equivocating sisters of fate who by their promises drive to crime those who listen to them, and who by the double-edged character of what they announced as a certainty deceived him who relied on the obvious meaning. So, the point here, let me just read one. Well, actually, yeah. We'll just say the point here is the oracle, the god, the assurance, you can't really trust them because they are actually on this side just as much as on your side. There is a concealment going on, right? So then he brings up another possibility, and this is the one associated with Hamlet. The consciousness, therefore, that is purer than the latter, which believes witches and is more prudent, more solid and thorough than the former who trusts the priestesses and the beautiful God, tarries with his revenge, even though the very spirit of his father reveals to him the crime by which he was murdered and institutes still other proofs. Okay, so that's clearly Hamlet, right? That there's no ancient Greek tragedy, as far as we know, that corresponds to that. And Hegel didn't have any more Greek tragedies than we currently do. Some of them have been lost, actually. The vast majority of them have been lost. And, we haven't made a lot of advance on that. So what does Hamlet do? Hamlet doesn't act, or he acts in a way that only goes so far. And he does so because he doesn't really have full knowledge about who is to blame, full knowledge about what he ought to do, full knowledge of the consequences. We have another case where there's a conspiracy between family members, and that's quite problematic. And notice what he says. There's another reason as well. For the reason this revelatory spirit could also be the devil, leading you astray. So, what if the oracle is not beneficent? What if the ghost of your father isn't really the ghost of your father, but is really a demon trying to tempt you into doing bad things against your own family? Hamlet says, I got to be kind of careful. And what happens to him? Does this save him? Does this save the people he's involved with? I mean, if you read that play, almost everybody is dead at the end. So, no, it's not. And then the house is basically destroyed, right? So we have a lot of things going on here. And there's, unpacking this division of the form or of knowledge sure tells us a lot about tragedy and about what the key thematics of it are. The last thing I do want to say is, can we shoehorn all Greek tragedy into this perspective? I've got my doubts about that. I think, there are plays that are easier to do that with, and there are plays that are harder to do that with. I've been thinking as I've been, talking here about whether the Medea can really fit this mold. And I'm not sure that it really fits that well. So that would be one major Greek play of massive influence throughout antiquity that doesn't fit this. But you get where Hegel's going. He's following out the threads that seem to him useful for illuminating this matter.